Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next of our series of podcasts focusing on international employment law. I'm Ailey Murray, a senior counsel in the employment team at Travers Smith, and this month I'm joined by Sian Keel, a partner in the team. And you may remember that in these podcasts, we're speaking to friends from law firms in a variety of jurisdictions and asking them about the key employment law issues and things to think about when employing staff in their country. And for each jurisdiction, we're doing 3 short podcasts, one covering the start of employment, the second covering the end of employment, and the final one covering other key aspects of employment law for their jurisdiction. And today we're speaking to Maria de Lancastre Valente from SRS Legal in Portugal. SRS Legal is a full-service, multi-practice leading Portuguese law firm, and their employment team are Tier 1 ranked by Legal 500. So welcome, Maria.
Welcome, thank you.
And in this first podcast, as usual, we'll start by looking at the start of employment. And I'll hand over to Sian to kick us off with the questions.
Thanks, Ailey. Hello, everyone. Just to start, Maria, can you give us a brief overview of how employment relationships are structured from a legal perspective in Portugal?
Absolutely. And I think it's an interesting question because I think it helps explain why we operate the way we do. And so basically the main idea that is, I think, interesting to get across is that we are a civil law-based country. So we have a labour code. The labour code regulates the life of the employment relationship cycle from the pre-contractual moment until the end of the employment contract, and it also covers other issues like collective bargaining and collective representation. So our main source of law and it is a labour code, and obviously we then enjoy a principle of contractual freedom, which means basically that within the boundaries of the law and where they exist within the boundaries of collective labour instruments that sit above the law, they typically contain provisions that are more favourable than what is foreseen in the labour code. So you have the collective bargaining agreements, you have the labour code, and then you have the employment contracts. So whenever a term and condition is not regulated by the labour code or by a collective bargaining agreement, and if it is where it is silent, the parties are free to contract in the terms that they so wish. This is important to understand why certain things work in a certain way and why the freedom to maneuver and to navigate employment relationships works in a certain way, and why some things do not necessarily have to be negotiated in an employment contract for them to occur or for certain terms and conditions to prevail. So typically, we sometimes face questions related to why certain terms and conditions are not established in the contract and what the consequences are if they're not. And this is basically the answer, because you have a labour code, you have the law or a collective bargaining agreement or a labour instrument that already explains or regulates certain terms and conditions. And the fact that they're not in the contract does not mean that they do not exist and that certain rights and obligations do not exist either. So I think that's the main sort of the framework that is important to underline.
That's really helpful, and obviously that's quite different from how we operate in the UK. And so often at the start of employment, we see employers want to carry out background checks or employee screening. Is that something that's permitted or usual practice in Portugal?
It's permitted to a certain extent. So the way that, and certainly within a multinational environment, it is usual practice for companies to carry out background checks. I think the main point is that in Portugal and in many other EU countries, there's a principle of privacy that supports the employment relationship as well. So it's broader, but the employment, and the labour code in particular also clearly states that an employee is entitled to his or her right of privacy. So I would say that the background checks certain background checks are possible, but that they will be possible if they do not conflict with that right of privacy, and they will necessarily have to be, so the intrusion into that right of privacy will have to be adequate and proportional. So for instance, under Portuguese law, employers cannot ask employees for certain information relating to their personal background, or to their religion, or to their ethnicity, or to their to other elements that are, or that constitute the employees, what we call the employee's personality, the elements of an individual's personality. What an employer can do is have, for instance, an employee sit a medical exam through occupational health and safety providers that will then tell the employer that the person is fit to work, and that's the only thing that the employer will receive. So the employer will not have access to medical records, will not have access to financial accounts. Typically, the information that is requested must have a reason. In some cases, it will be possible, depending on the role the employee performs. But the main message is that background checks have to be approached with caution, and there are things that you can and cannot do, and things that you can and cannot ask an employee.
That makes sense. That's really helpful. And so one of the things we often see is concerns about recruiting from a competitor. So does that give any rise to any issues in Portugal?
Taking a step back, so in Portugal we do have the concept of post-termination restrictions and non-compete. Again, the way the law construes this is that an employee has a freedom to access employment and cannot be restricted, and the exception being post-termination restrictions that then have to follow specific criteria to be lawful. I think in the first instance the issue will relate directly to the employee. So if the employee is breaching a non-compete or a particular post-termination restriction, then obviously the employee may face issues from his or her past employer. It is not very common, in my experience, to have employers, past and new employers, disputing because of a recruitment. What I would say is that ultimately, yes, it can give rise to a case of unlawful competition, but I think in the first instance the issue will be more related to the outcome for the actual employee. What sometimes, and what we do see in employment contracts, and particularly in sectors where information and proprietary information, or depending on the sector, all aspects related to competition are more sensitive, is for contracts to contain a guarantee, something in the contract that's stated by the employee saying that he or she is not under a post-termination restriction at the time of his or her hire. So I think provided that the employer, when the employer is hiring, flags that out to the candidate and the employee, and then has that wording in the contract, that should be sufficient.
Thanks, Maria. And finally, let's assume you've found your chosen candidate. What does a business need to think about in relation to documenting the terms it's reached? And I imagine that the answer to your very first question is relevant to this.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. So I think what a company needs to think about, an employee needs to think about is, first of all, how are they going to hire the individual in question, and how the employer wants the main terms and conditions to be governed based on their context, based on their specific organizational context. Because employment law in Portugal is regulated, I think obviously you can't expect companies and HR professionals, and even in-house or internal legal counsel, to know the answers to everything, especially in a sort of an international context. But I would say that the most relevant point here is to know how to ask the right questions, or to identify potential issues that may pose or that may warrant asking if the question if an issue has relevance from a legal perspective. So what I would say is, first of all, hiring and by using the right employment contract type is very relevant, and this is because we have a regulated termination regime. So you want to make sure, and it's paradoxical to talk about termination when you're hiring, but if you want to make sure that the employment relationship runs smoothly across its life cycle, you will want to invest in hiring properly, so that if and when necessary, you can also terminate effectively. So the first thing I'd say is hiring effectively, choosing the right type of employment contract, choosing the right working time arrangement, thinking about the role that you're hiring for, and making sure that, bearing in mind that role, bearing in mind what your operational and business needs are, that you use labor law in your favor, so that company can use the maximum, take as much flexibility as it can out of the regimes that are provided for by law. So thinking about remuneration and the impact that may have, thinking about the working time regimes, thinking about the employment contract types. These are all issues, thinking about workplace and what type of arrangement an employer wants to have in place. These are all core terms and conditions that will structure and influence the way an employment contract will evolve.
Perfect. Thank you, Maria. That was really interesting. And that concludes our first in these 3 podcasts. And so please do join us in the next podcasts, where we'll be covering the end of employment.